Before a single punch was thrown, or a single word was defended, Muhammad Ali was already on trial. The studio lights were hot, the cameras unforgiving, and the question hanging in the air was heavier than any opponent he had ever faced. This was not about boxing records or comeback fights. It was about loyalty, sacrifice, and whether one man's refusal could ever be justified when others had paid with their lives. Across the table sat a journalist who was no longer asking as a professional, but as a brother who had buried someone he loved. Everyone expected Ali to do what he had always done when cornered: fight back with brilliance, with language sharp enough to leave no opening. He had earned that right. The law was on his side. History, some believed, would be too. One cutting response could have ended the exchange and sent the audience home satisfied. But Ali did not raise his voice. He did not recite doctrine or deliver a speech meant for applause. Instead, he leaned into the tension and told a quiet story that no one was prepared for. What followed did not change the war or settle the argument, but it changed the room and revealed a kind of courage that cannot be measured in wins, losses, or words alone. The interview was supposed to be routine. A long table, 3 microphones, a dozen reporters, and a fighter who had learned to live under the weight of questions that were never really questions at all. Muhammad Ali sat back in his chair, long legs stretched slightly forward, hands folded loosely in his lap. His face was calm, almost distant, but the room around him was tightening. You could feel it in the way people shifted their notebooks, in the way breaths were held just a second too long before being released. The host leaned forward and asked what sounded, at first, like another variation of an accusation Ali had heard 100 times. But there was an edge to it, a tone sharpened by fatigue and something closer to resentment. The question wasn't about boxing. It wasn't even about politics in the abstract. It was about loyalty, about responsibility, about whether a man who refused to fight in one war had any right to call himself a champion of anything at all. A murmur moved through the room. Ali didn't interrupt. He didn't smile. He didn't deflect with poetry or bravado. He looked at the interviewer steadily, as if measuring not the words but the weight behind them. Everyone expected the familiar responses: wit, challenge, verbal counterpunches that had made Ali famous beyond the ring. Some expected anger. Others expected him to stand up and leave. Instead, he stayed still. The interviewer pressed harder. He spoke about sacrifice, about men who had died, about families who had paid the price, while Ali, in his words, stood apart. It was no longer an interview. It was a confrontation, unfolding in public, and the cameras were rolling. Ali was being asked to justify his life in front of strangers, to explain himself yet again, to defend convictions that had already cost him years of his career. What happened next would not raise voices or draw applause. It would not end the argument in any obvious way, but it would quietly change the room. This took place on the 14th of April, 1971, in a television studio in New York City, at a moment when the country itself was unsure what it believed anymore. By the spring of 1971, Muhammad Ali was no longer just a former heavyweight champion attempting a comeback. He had become a living fault line in the American conscience. Nearly 4 years had passed since the moment he stood before a draft board in Houston and calmly refused induction into the United States Army. That single act had detonated far beyond the room it occurred in, rippling outward into courtrooms, newspaper headlines, church pulpits, and dinner table arguments across the country. Ali lost his title. He lost his license. He lost years of his physical prime. What he gained was something far heavier to carry: the role of a symbol in a nation tearing itself apart. America in 1971 was exhausted. The Vietnam War had stretched on longer than leaders promised, and cost far more lives than the public had been prepared to accept. Images of body bags, burning villages, and grieving families were no longer abstract reports from overseas. They arrived nightly on television screens, intimate and unavoidable. Protest had become commonplace, but so had resentment toward those protests. For every march demanding an end to the war, there were citizens who felt such dissent dishonored the dead. The country was not arguing anymore. It was entrenched. Ali stood at the center of this divide in a way few others did. Unlike politicians, he did not hedge his language. Unlike activists, without public platforms, he could not be ignored. He spoke with conviction about his faith as a member of the Nation of Islam, about his belief that participation in the war would violate his conscience. He questioned why he should fight abroad for freedoms denied to Black Americans at home. These were not statements made quietly or cautiously. They were spoken plainly, often poetically, and always under a glare of attention. To supporters, Ali embodied moral courage. He was proof that conviction could outweigh comfort, that a man could sacrifice fame and fortune rather than betray his beliefs. To critics, he represented something far more dangerous. They saw him as defiant, ungrateful, and destabilizing. A young Black man refusing orders in a country built on obedience during wartime was, to many, an unforgivable provocation. His confidence, his refusal to sound ashamed, only deepened their anger. Legally, Ali's case had wound its way through the courts for years. His conviction for draft evasion hung over him like a shadow until the Supreme Court unanimously overturned it in June of 1971, citing procedural failures. But in April, when this interview took place, that outcome was not yet known. His future was still uncertain. He had been allowed to box again in a limited capacity, but his standing remained fragile. One wrong phrase could cost him public goodwill. One moment of perceived arrogance could be used to confirm every accusation leveled against him. Financially, Ali had survived on speaking engagements and exhibitions during his ban, but it had not replaced what he lost. Physically, he had aged without the benefit of professional competition, his reflexes dulled by time rather than punches. Emotionally, he had endured years of being called a coward, a traitor, an enemy. Each appearance before microphones required him to reopen those wounds for public inspection. The tension surrounding Ali was not theoretical. It was deeply personal for millions of Americans who had sons, brothers, and husbands overseas or buried. The war had blurred the line between political disagreement and personal grief. In that climate, Ali's name alone could ignite anger or admiration before he said a word. So, when he sat down in that New York studio, the stakes were not confined to his career or reputation. He was entering a space charged with unresolved sorrow, bitterness, and moral confusion. Every question carried more than curiosity. It carried history, loss, and an unspoken demand. Explain yourself in a way that makes our pain make sense. Ali knew this. He had lived inside this tension for years. He understood that what the country wanted from him was not information, but absolution or surrender. And he understood that neither was something he could give. That was the weight pressing down on the table that afternoon, long before the interview turned hostile. The man seated across from Muhammad Ali that afternoon was not a provocateur looking for spectacle, nor a commentator chasing ratings through outrage. Thomas Keller had built his reputation slowly, story by story, conflict by conflict. In his early career, he had reported from the American South during the height of the civil rights movement, standing in crowds where anger crackled in the air and violence felt one careless word away. Later, he embedded with military units overseas, not to glorify war but to understand its human cost. He was known among colleagues as measured, disciplined, and deeply serious about the responsibilities of public conversation. But what the audience at home could not see was the quiet burden Keller carried into the studio that day. 2 years earlier, his younger brother David had been killed in Vietnam. David was 22, freshly graduated, drafted into a war he barely understood, and sent into a jungle thousands of miles from home. The letter that informed the family of his death arrived folded into official language, careful and distant. Keller remembered reading it alone in his apartment, the words blurring until they lost meaning altogether. Grief did not announce itself loudly in his life. It settled in, reshaping his sense of purpose and sharpening his moral expectations of others. David had not been a soldier by inclination. He had planned to teach history. He believed in service, but not in war. When the draft notice came, there was no protest, no defiance. There was only compliance, and the quiet hope that the war would end before it reached him. Keller watched his brother accept a fate he had no real power to refuse. That memory followed him into every conversation about Vietnam, especially those involving men who had chosen a different path. To Keller, Muhammad Ali represented a contradiction he could not reconcile. Here was a man with immense influence, able to refuse in ways others could not. Ali's eloquence, his fame, his religious conviction, all of it seemed to create a distance between him and the millions who never had the luxury of choice. Keller did not see Ali as malicious or dishonest. He saw him as someone whose personal morality collided painfully with collective sacrifice. That collision troubled Keller deeply. As a journalist, he believed in asking questions that mattered. As a brother, he believed that those questions carried a weight beyond professional obligation. He did not want Ali to perform or posture. He wanted him to confront, plainly and honestly, what refusal meant to families like his. Yet Keller was not immune to doubt. In the months leading up to the interview, he had read accounts of returning veterans who felt betrayed by the war itself, men who questioned why they had been sent to fight. He had seen protests grow not only louder but more complicated. The moral clarity he once believed in had begun to erode, replaced by a gnawing sense that the country had demanded obedience without understanding its cost. Still, when Keller looked at Ali, doubt hardened into urgency. This was not just another interview. This was a chance to ask a question that had lingered unanswered in his own life. His tone, while controlled, carried the pressure of unresolved grief. His posture was rigid, his notes precise, but beneath that discipline was a man trying to make sense of loss through accountability. He did not intend to humiliate Ali. He intended to challenge him, to press past slogans and arrive at something human and difficult. Keller believed that if Ali truly stood by his convictions, he should be able to face the pain those convictions stirred in others. As the cameras rolled, Keller felt the familiar weight settle into his chest. He reminded himself that journalism was not therapy, and the studio was not a place for personal reckoning. But some histories refuse to stay buried. They surface in moments like this, when two men sit across from each other, carrying different versions of the same national wound, each convinced that the truth demands to be spoken aloud. The shift in the room did not happen all at once. It began subtly, in the way Thomas Keller's questions lost their neutrality and took on a sharper edge, in the way the other reporters stopped interjecting and allowed the exchange to narrow into something more intimate and more dangerous. What had been a broad conversation about Ali's return to boxing quietly collapsed into a single, unresolved tension that no one could step around anymore. Keller leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, his voice steady but weighted. He spoke about duty, about the idea that a nation at war survives only when its citizens accept shared risk. He spoke of young men who never stood behind microphones, who never had the opportunity to articulate refusal in eloquent language, who simply went because they were told to go. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse Ali of cowardice outright. He framed his words carefully, as though precision could keep emotion contained. Ali listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. He did not offer his usual interjections or playful corrections. The stillness around him was deliberate. He rested his forearms on the chair's arms, fingers loosely curled, eyes fixed on Keller. The longer Keller spoke, the more the room seemed to hold its breath. Then Keller asked the question that stripped away any remaining pretense of detachment. He asked how Ali reconciled his refusal with the knowledge that others had died in a war they could not avoid. He spoke of families left with folded flags and unanswered questions. He asked whether Ali believed personal conviction should outweigh collective obligation when the cost was measured in lives. A murmur moved through the studio. One reporter shifted in his seat. A producer glanced toward the cameras, uncertain whether to intervene. This was no longer an exchange of ideas. It was an indictment delivered with restraint, sharpened by personal loss. Ali had every right to shut the moment down. He could have reminded Keller that the courts had ruled in his favor. He could have cited constitutional protections, religious freedom, or the hypocrisy of a nation that demanded sacrifice abroad while denying equality at home. Any of those responses would have been defensible, even expected. The audience would have recognized them as familiar terrain. Instead, Ali did something unexpected. He did not answer immediately. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and exposed. It was not the silence of a man searching for words, but of a man deciding which words would do the least harm. Ali glanced briefly at the table, then back at Keller. His breathing slowed. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, stripped of performance. He did not begin with justification. He did not begin with belief. He began by acknowledging the weight of the question. He said that he understood why such anger existed, why grief demanded explanation. He said that no answer he gave could bring anyone back or make loss acceptable. Keller's posture stiffened slightly, as though bracing for argument. But Ali did not move toward defense. He asked Keller a question instead, one that shifted the balance of the room. He asked whether Keller had lost someone in the war. The studio seemed to contract around that moment. Keller hesitated, his professionalism colliding with something raw. He nodded. Once. The acknowledgement changed the temperature of the exchange. What had been public now carried the intimacy of confession. Ali did not press. He simply waited. Keller spoke of his brother, briefly at first, then with more detail than he likely intended. He mentioned age, circumstance, the way the news arrived. His voice remained controlled, but the control felt fragile. The room was silent now, not out of anticipation, but respect. Ali listened, his gaze steady, his body still. He did not interrupt or correct or redirect. The confrontation had reached its peak, not through volume or spectacle, but through the exposure of something deeply personal. The question hanging in the air was no longer about policy or patriotism. It was about how two men, shaped by different forms of loss, could occupy the same moral space without denying each other's pain. Everyone in the room understood that whatever Ali said next would determine whether the moment collapsed into defensiveness or opened into something else entirely. Muhammad Ali did not rush to fill the silence that followed Keller's admission. He allowed it to remain, not as a tactic, but as a sign of respect. When he finally spoke, it was with the careful steadiness of someone aware that every word would land on exposed ground. He thanked Keller for saying his brother's name out loud. He said that too often, the people lost in war were reduced to numbers or arguments, stripped of the ordinary details that made them human. He asked Keller what his brother had loved before the war found him. The question was gentle, almost hesitant, and it altered the posture of the room. Keller answered, his voice quieter now, describing small things, early mornings, books, the way his brother laughed when he was nervous. Ali listened with an attention that felt uncommon in public life. He did not interrupt or redirect the conversation back to himself. When Keller finished, Ali nodded slowly, as if committing the details to memory. Then he spoke of a boy he had grown up with in Louisville, someone he trained alongside when boxing was still a dream and not a destiny. That boy, too, had been drafted. Ali said he remembered seeing his name printed in a local paper months later, beneath a headline that reduced an entire life to a single line of text. Ali did not present the story as proof of shared suffering or moral equivalence. He acknowledged the difference plainly. He said he knew his fame had insulated him in ways others were not. He said he had wrestled with that truth, especially during the years when he was barred from boxing and forced to confront the consequences of his refusal in isolation. He admitted that conviction did not erase guilt, and that standing firm did not mean standing untouched. He explained that his decision had not been made lightly or in anger, but in fear of what killing would do to his soul. He said he believed courage could take forms that were not easily recognized, and that sometimes the hardest thing a man could do was to refuse a role written for him by history and expectation. He made it clear that this belief did not invalidate the sacrifices of those who served, nor did it diminish the grief of those left behind. Keller listened, no longer as an interrogator, but as someone trying to reconcile two truths that had long felt irreconcilable. His shoulders lowered slightly, the rigidity in his posture softened. He asked, almost quietly, whether Ali ever questioned his path, whether doubt followed him even now. Ali answered without hesitation that doubt had never left him. He said, faith, for him, was not the absence of uncertainty, but the willingness to carry it without surrendering compassion. He said he had no desire to be admired for his stance, only understood as a man who chose the burden he could live with. The room remained still as Ali finished. No one spoke immediately. The confrontation had dissolved, not because one side had won, but because the terms of the exchange had changed. What began as an accusation had become an acknowledgement of shared pain expressed through different choices. When the interview concluded, there was no sense of resolution in the traditional sense. The questions surrounding the war, duty, and conscience remained unresolved, as they would for years to come. But something quieter had taken place. Two men had met not as symbols, but as individuals shaped by loss, conviction, and the limits of certainty. As the cameras stopped rolling, Keller thanked Ali privately, not for his answers, but for his patience. Ali nodded, offering nothing more than a handshake and a tired smile. He had not defended himself in the way many expected. He had done something more difficult. He had made space for grief without abandoning belief. In that moment, Ali demonstrated a form of strength that rarely makes headlines. Not the strength to dominate, but the strength to remain open under pressure. It was a reminder that moral courage does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes, it speaks in a quiet story, told carefully enough to be heard. In the years that followed, Muhammad Ali would be remembered for many things: the speed of his hands, the rhythm of his words, the defiance that cost him his title and reshaped his life. History would debate his choices, argue over his convictions, and turn his image into symbol after symbol, often stripping away the man beneath them. But moments like this interview resist that flattening. What happened in that studio did not resolve the nation's questions about war, duty, or conscience. It did something quieter and perhaps more enduring. It showed that strength does not always arrive as an answer, and courage does not always look like certainty. Sometimes it appears as the willingness to listen when accused, to honor grief without surrendering belief, and to remain human when the world demands performance. Ali did not ask to be forgiven that day, nor did he ask to be admired. He chose something more difficult: to meet another man's pain without denying his own truth. In doing so, he reminded everyone watching that moral conviction is not proven by how loudly it is defended, but by how carefully it is carried. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, that lesson remained. Not as a slogan, but as a standard. One that asks whether we can hold our beliefs firmly while keeping our hearts open, even under pressure. That, more than any victory inside the ring, is the kind of legacy that endures.